In the last video, I mentioned that if you call a function or subroutine which has arguments defined, you need to supply a value for each of those arguments. As is often the case in programming, this is only partially true. In fact, you can make arguments optional, which means that when you call the function or subroutine, you can either supply a value or you can simply omit it. In this video, we'll look at how this process works. We'll stay with the same example of creating a document, inserting a table, and putting headings in the first row. But let's say we want to make the insertion of headings more flexible. We want to cater for a maximum of 6 headings, but we want the flexibility of being able to enter fewer than 6 headings. Optional arguments provides a mechanism for making this happen. Again, we'll call this main, and we can then call the function and subroutine that we used in the last video. And let's say this time we only want to enter 3 columns of information. Let's now refer back to the macro that we wrote in the first video. So here we had this third subroutine called create headings. So let's now copy this. So this will be 0404B. And instead of having these fixed headings, we now want the flexibility, first of all, of being able to supply our strings as parameter values, and secondly, of being able to vary the number of parameters that are actually in use. So to do this, we define our arguments or parameters, but with each one, we specify that it's optional. There are 3 things to remember when creating optional arguments. The first is that optional arguments always follow obligatory arguments. So if your subroutine or function requires both, you put the regular arguments first, and then you put any optional arguments. The second thing is that you use the keyword optional before the name of the parameter. And the third thing to remember is that you need to supply a default value for the optional argument, which will be used if no value is supplied when the function or subroutine is called. So in this example, we don't have any obligatory parameters. We want to create simply a series of optional parameters. So we use the keyword optional, and these are strings, so let's call them strh1, etc. as string, and then we supply a default value. In this case, a good choice will be the blank or empty string. That way, when we move to the cell and enter the text, we'll be entering nothing, so we won't be modifying the table. So that's our first parameter. Let's just go on to another line, and then we can tab across and just copy what we had before. So we want to enter a maximum of 6 of these. So we can just paste, return, and then just modify the names. And here obviously this is the last one, so no comma and no underscore. The next thing we need to change is that these values will be used in the function call, and these parameter names will be actually used within the subroutine. So we're going to have just 3. Let's say we want the report name, the date due, and the percent complete. So let's just move these into the function call. So we want to call this, and then we want to supply as parameters report name. So I'll cut this and just paste it in. And let's use the same style by splitting each value onto a separate line. Then we want due date. So this time let's drag and just tab that across. Split the line. And finally, we wanted percent complete. And close. So these will be the only three arguments that we supply, and obviously they'll go into strh1, h2 and h3 respectively. The last three arguments will simply stay as their default value. So the final thing we have to do is to use strh1 as the text for this one, and h2 and so forth. So we just need one more. These two lines, copy, paste, and change that to a 6. So after we've created a table, we end up in the first cell. We enter the first heading, move down one, enter the second, and so forth. So there is a fair bit of redundancy in this process, and those of you who have programming experience will be thinking of conditionals and loops to make the code a bit more efficient. But with what we've covered, it still works. It's a bit long-winded, but basically these last three entries are blank strings, so they don't have any effect on the content of our table. So let's just check that our code works. So we'll save and run. And let's look at the table that we end up with. So we've got ourselves a 3-column table, and the headings have gone in, and the last three parameters, which we didn't supply a value for, don't do any harm at all. When defining a function or subroutine, obligatory arguments must always precede any optional arguments. To define an optional argument, use the keyword optional and supply a default value. Optional argument as data type equals default value. If no value is supplied for an optional argument, the default value will be used instead.